Wonderful. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second of our Back to School webinar series. This year, we are thrilled to be here with our friends from NCSS, the National Council for the Social Studies, to follow up on a conversation that we had last year at our Equity Summit. So before we get started tonight, just a couple of norms and things to think about as we're in this space. Please use the chat. Talk to each other, talk to the panelists. Please have conversations there. But if you do have any questions for our panelists, Taslyn and Courtney, put those in the Q&A. And we will address those towards the end of the webinar. But feel free to use the chat to introduce yourselves. Make sure that your chat is set to everyone instead of hosts and panelists. You'll see the little blue drop down and make sure it says everyone. Otherwise, you're just going to be talking to us. So we're going to get started. I want to make sure we have a lot of time here to chat. I'm going to introduce some of our friends here in the presenter room, and I'm going to start with Jennifer Morgan, who's the current president of the National Council for the Social Studies. So Jennifer, do you want to say hi to the people?
Hello, everybody. I'm Jennifer Morgan. I teach in Western Wisconsin. On behalf of Dr. Larry Paskin, everyone at NCSS, and myself, welcome to those returning to this year's update on the summit and those joining for the very first time. NCSS is grateful to continue partnering with NCHE for this important webinar. If you find value in today's session, we invite you to continue looking at our partnerships work, including the Equity Summit, which I'm sure we'll hear more about on September 28th, or consider joining a bunch of us in Boston in November for the NCSS conference.
Awesome. Thanks, Jenny. It's good to lots of Midwesterners in the room, which is pretty cool. So Jenny is joined here by Ashante Horton and Keely Mata also from NCSS. I'm Jessica Ellison. I am the Executive Director of the National Council for History Education, and I'm joined by my colleague, Shauna Liverati, who is beaming in from Florida, and I'm up in Minnesota. So we are well represented here, and we're glad to see you all. Before we get started, we're going to do a really quick recap of the Equity Summit from last year. So some of you might have attended the event last year, but I just want us all to start kind of on the same foundation for this conversation tonight. NCSS and NCHE have been partnering on a virtual equity summit since the pandemic. It has taken different forms over the last couple of years. But last summer, our virtual Equity Summit focused on book banning and censorship, which is and continues to be a hot topic in schools and libraries around the country. And so we had a number of presenters talk about their experiences in the world of book banning and censorship, including a number of classroom educators who presented to our attendees. And this evening, we have brought back two of those presenters to kind of give us where are we now, everyone? Almost a year after our Equity Summit last fall. And I will let them introduce themselves, but we have with us Courtney Pentland and Taslyn Magnuson, who were on a panel with us last year at the Equity Summit and are here to kind of give us the update. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Courtney, and I'm going to turn off my video, but we are all here listening and are super excited that you're here with us today, Courtney.
Okay, I am going to introduce myself very quickly and then pass it over to Taslyn, and then we'll come back and talk about school library end of things. But my name is Courtney Pentland, and I am a high school librarian in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I was invited to the Equity Summit last year because at the time I was the president of the American Association of School Librarians, and I am now the immediate past president. So my involvement at the national level is still pretty intense. I don't get as much of the day-to-day things, but obviously there's a lot of what has been happening in the country on my radar for the last, several years. I am going to put a link to an article from School Library Journal in the chat that is going to go over quite a few of the things that are newer since we met with the Equity Summit. some of the things that have happened in the last year is that legislation was passed in a variety of places that was detrimental to intellectual freedom. And in response to those actions, there have been several lawsuits that have been filed. There have been at least 2 in Florida. There's one that was specifically in response to actions in a school district. And then most recently, just at the end of last month, there was a lawsuit that was filed on behalf of a wide range of big publishers like Penguin Random House, Hachette, HarperCollins, Macmillan, Simon & Schuster, big name authors like Julia Alvarez, John Green, Laurie Halse Anderson, Jodi Picoult, and Angie Thomas. So, and 2 parents that are suing the actual state of Florida over the law that was passed that is affecting many of the school districts there. So we are seeing some responses to those pieces of legislation. We are also seeing some other fallout from those types of legislation. You may have heard that in Utah, there were 13 books that were banned statewide in schools. So that's a huge one that has not had legal recourse yet, but I would assume that there would be something coming in the future, potentially. In my own neck of the woods here in Nebraska, our governor appointed an ex-school board member to our library commission's board who was actually removed from her school board position, partially because she tried to ban more than 50 books from the middle and high school libraries. She was voted to be removed by 62% of the population in her area. She has been working with other groups like Moms for Liberty, who are at the heart of some of the censorship issues that we're seeing in the country, and he decided to put her on our state library commission board. So there has been some pushback from the communities in that way. There was a board meeting on Friday, and there were people who showed up to speak in protest of her appointment. So we will see responses to those censorship acts coming up here and there, which is a very positive, I view that as a positive thing, that there are people who are willing to push back, that there are big companies who are willing to put their funding and their time and their money behind it, and their lawyers. And that there are still lawsuits being filed, for example, in the state of Missouri, where they passed a law that would criminalize teachers and librarians for providing material to children. So that is being fought by the Missouri ACLU, the Missouri School Library Association, and the Missouri Library Association. So that is an ongoing piece of legislation. And then there are things like, let me grab it off my bookshelf. My friend Amanda Jones wrote a book called That Librarian. She is from a parish in Louisiana. She is a middle school librarian, and she spoke out at her public school board meeting, public library meeting as a citizen of the area about censorship in the public library, and she was summarily targeted with harassment and death threats for doing that, and has been for the last few years in her community. And she wrote a book about her experience and what she's gone through. And if you would like to know what it's like to be a school librarian in the United States, this is a great book to pick up. There's also some other people's experiences that have been written in, like Trouble in Censorville. There's a couple other school librarians where it's talking about how people in public education are fighting back. Martha Hickson is in this one. She's in New Jersey. She has been summarily targeted specifically by a few different people, and she has gone through it. Julie Miller in Florida, who is mentioned in this book, left the school librarian profession because of what was happening to her. Gavin Downing, a middle school librarian, also issues that he's been having. So if you're, like I said, curious about what educators have been facing and what they are going through, I'm going to say we've got a couple more in here. Alyssa Malaspina, she actually was fired from her job for speaking out on behalf of students and against censorship. And Carolyn Foote, who I am repping, the freedom fighters from Texas. Carolyn Foote is one of the original freedom fighters who started that, along with Becky Calzada, who is our current AASL president, against the actions that were happening in Texas. So there are a lot of people who are speaking out and fighting back and doing so much to counter what is happening, but it's still happening. So we have work to do. And but I feel like it's not only darkness, there is light that's in there too. Taslyn?
Thanks. Yeah, I was trying to keep up and throw down some good links in the chat for y'all. Taslyn Magnuson. I have been researching book bans now for about 3 years. It's really important for me to let y'all know that I am not a librarian. I am not a teacher. I come from a kid lit background. I have a master's in fine arts, writing for children and young adults. And so about 21, I was hanging out on the internet, watching things, and I began to hear my friends talk about, oh my gosh, we're getting banned more. Then Lori Halse Anderson said, yes, it's definitely more, and we should keep track. And I was like, yeah, I can keep track. And now here I am 3 years later with a full-time, like more than full-time job. So I have learned so much from the teachers and librarians who have shared their experience and time and passion and commitment to this work. And I am doing everything I can to support them and raise them up and talk about book bans. So the news is not good. I'm sorry to say, I'd love to be able to tell you I'm asked all the time, is it getting better? And I'm like, no, sorry, it's getting worse. And it will probably continue to get worse because of the legislation and because of the actions of groups on the ground. So we have the legislation, and all that does, well, it does a number of things, but it amplifies and accelerates exponentially the ability to get books off the shelf quickly. So in Iowa, in response to SF 496, I believe, the Dispatch, Des Moines Dispatch, put together a database of all the books, and there are thousands that were pulled before that law was enjoined. About 1,000 went back, and now, unfortunately, since the temporary enjoyment was lifted, they are likely going off the shelves again. I tell people often it's a little bit like shoveling. They are shoveling books off the shelves, and it's discouraging, it's frustrating, it's unconstitutional, it's concerning, and it's overwhelming. And what I hear from authors, I think it's really important to recognize probably one of my favorite movements that has happened. It's called Authors Against Book Bans. And that is a group of authors who joined together and said, we can do something, we need to do something. And they are there. And if you don't know about them, they have two paths. One is to speak out, one is to continue to pressure publishers to continue to work on lawsuits. And the other is to take care of educators and librarians that have been harmed and that continue to be harmed. And they are there. And if you know somebody who really needs some support, and would love to hear from an author that they care about, I promise you they're probably on the list and they're willing to give them a call. And what they discovered is sometimes that little moment of sort of recognizing all of the work of educators and librarians is a really important one. And they really see that as a special thing that they can do. And they are making a difference. I've watched authors, especially in Texas, Authors Against Book Bans, align with Texas Freedom to Read Project. And together they are working with local communities to put a break on some censorship, put a break on some attacks by school board members in Texas. When I talk about groups, a great one to think about is the Citizens Defending Freedom and the pastors. Texas Freedom to Read Project calls them the pastors, the traveling pastors circus. And it is a group of pastors that move from district to district to district and bring their list of 600 plus books, then do dramatic readings, as we've seen across the country, of excerpts out of context, and do whatever they can to pressure districts to remove books immediately. And so the pastors and Citizens Defending Freedom are not the only ones. Moms for Liberty, of course, is still doing their thing. Don't believe any article that tells you they're dying. They are not. They are just gently reforming. Probably the most important thing that I can tell you tonight, and especially with some Midwesterners on here, is those of us who live in blue states must listen. Listen, we like to think a blue state saves us. What's happening in blue states is much harder to track. It's much harder to get a handle on, but it's happening district by district, library by library. The same kind of impetus that's behind the statewide legislation in a red state is coming to your local library, your local district. And it's pressure, the same pressure tactics, the same extraordinary level of fear mongering, and the same attacks on education. So what we all need to do is something that we've been telling everyone to do for a couple of years now, but show up, speak up, and be listening at those meetings for the emergence of this, because it happens in Wisconsin. They've been bouncing from public library to public school district, don't get any traction in one, turn around and move to the other. And it's pretty much a tried and true pathway. Bright spots, wrote some down. Authors Against Book Bans, the extraordinary educators and librarians who speak out, like Amanda, like everybody in Trouble in Censorville, who have bravely shared their experience, the students that are sharing their experience across the country. They should not have to. I'm always asked, how can I get a student to talk? And I'm like, you actually shouldn't. It's our job as the adults to speak up. And I'm very clear with any community that I work with. Like, if a student comes and says, I have things to say, you should welcome it and love it. But really their job is to be students, not to speak up for the freedom to read. And we place a lot of pressure on students. So everywhere where I'm going, I'm finding communities that are looking to fight back. Sometimes it's too late. They've lost a lot of books. They've lost a lot of educators. Florida's losing educators left, right, and center. They've had librarians doxxed. They've had lost author visits, but they're still coming. They're still showing up. They're still trying to figure out what to do next. And we are here for them. I work with every library, and I work with a program called Fight for the First. And basically that is me and Pete Bromberg sitting in a Zoom discussing kind of like what we can do to help you and help that community speak up for what they want and need, and a positive, inclusive, diverse literature and teaching that reflects the world that is, not the world that some people would like to be. The titles in terms of the PEN America research, we're finishing that. It's a lot harder to, we will see probably over 10,000 titles in the next year. report that should come out sometime at Banned Books Week. Don't share that number. Top secret, 10,000 and counting. Takes a long time to code those for content, but we are absolutely seeing the same and continued attacks on stories by and for LGBTQ folks, BIPOC voices, Black picture book stories, like histories, you name it, and it is under attack, and especially a movement towards attacking the stories of women and sexuality. So there's lots to talk about. It's going to get harder to track censorship, so it's going to become increasingly important for people to speak up, to report it. OIF. That's a great reporting tool. Penn has a reporting tool. I'm always there on the internet. You can find me. Taslin is a very unusual name, and I'm happy to walk with you as you speak out or report these things, because that's the only way that we can get at some of the quieter censorship that is becoming more and more prevalent. Let's do questions. Let's talk.
Thank you both so much for sharing so much of yourself in this, because I think, you know, you're in a room of educators. You know that it's not just a job. This is part of who you are and your calling. So I was looking through the PEN America book bans page, and there's an article that says, quote, "Thank you for not giving up on Florida." You know, and so I'd be interested in both of your thoughts about, you know, thank you for not giving up on Florida. Yes, like let's continue to go into places like that. But then also, Taslin, what you said about being in a state like Minnesota, like Illinois, we have to speak up too. So from where you both sit, what can people do right now, no matter where they live?
That is a really wonderful question. I dropped a couple of links in the chat. One of them is the challenge report tool from the Office for Intellectual Freedom. And then there's also Unite Against Book Bans, which is a partnership program with ALA, where they are looking at what can communities do, what can people in communities do to work against censorship in whatever way it's appearing where they are. I think the biggest thing is to make your voice heard, because whether you are an educator in your community or not, you're still a community member, right? So you can go to your public library board meeting and you can speak out on behalf of why you love your public library. There doesn't have to be animosity or issues happening in your area for you to come out and speak on behalf of the intellectual freedom and the freedom to read for anybody in your community, right? You can show up and say things positively. You can, if you do not feel comfortable doing that, you can submit a letter. You can write in and say what you love about your library, whatever that library happens to be. If there's legislation that is being proposed, learn how to make public comment on the legislation in your area. Every state is slightly different in the way that they do it, so you will need to figure out the rights and rules. Talk with your if you have a state education association, they're going to know, because they're the ones who have a lobbyist who is working on behalf of those types of issues. Your state library association and your state school library association would also be ones who would be able to help you with that. We have spent the last 4 years fighting legislation that has been troublesome here in Nebraska. One of them made it to the floor last year, and it just so happened that they were going to be voting on Library Advocacy Day. So there were a whole bunch of librarians who were scheduled to be at the Capitol that day anyway. And they had a couple evenings of debate over the bill. Those videos are available, my friends. You can go back and watch what your state legislators say in favor of or against some of these things, and that will open your eyes to how the political process works in some ways. If you are not, if you have not had the opportunity to watch a school board meeting or a library board meeting or a legislative hearing, do it. It will give you some really good information, not just for yourself, but to talk to your students about the legislative process. I actually used what was happening in our state legislature at the time in a lesson that I was doing with students. I said, okay, do you know how a bill becomes a law? I mean, like, we talk about that, right? But do you really know how that works here? And do you know that you as a citizen have the right to say things related to what is being proposed? And we talked through the process of how would you go about doing that. So just be educated in how that process works and find common ground, which is the thing that I have been told by many folks is finding common ground with whomever it happens to be, a school board member, a library board member, a legislator. You may not have the same beliefs on some things, but there probably are some things that you have in common, like protecting children or educational rights and things like that. Maybe you can find some common ground there to approach the topic with them in a way that could be productive. Not always easy, but something to think about. But there are a ton of resources that are out there that can help you. I'm looking at the Unite Against Book Bans website right now, and on the very first page, it says Guide to Attending Library and School Board Meetings. So if you want to know a little bit about, well, like, what can I do? There's a guide right there. They also started doing something called book resumes. And we see the traveling groups.
pastors.
I was going to say something, but I censored myself. The traveling group of folks who are, you know, maybe the pastors in Texas, but there's also people in Louisiana who are showing up at public library board meetings who are not even in that parish, and they are trying to stir up stuff that is going on. We have that happening in Nebraska in some places. People are coming from out of their area and talking about, you know, beware of what's there. So the Virginia Library Association started these, and it got picked up. ALA helped promote this, but these are the answer to some of those, like, taking things out of context. You know, it gives you in one spot awards, summary, any positive reviews, things like that, that you can have. Like, if a book is being, and these are frequently challenged books is what's going to end up on here, you have that in a one pager or a very short document all in one place. You don't have to gather all of that stuff together. It exists there. So there are people who are putting those resources together, and it's at your fingertips now, which is fantastic. So yeah, that's one of my things.
Those are all like incredibly good. I had forgotten about book resume. This is why it's like constantly there's a flow of information that does not stop. I really love, Courtney, one thing that you said about speaking positively. I tell people all the time, you do not need to answer the crazy that you're going to hear, because that's a rhetorical weapon designed to make people be silent. What you need to do is practice. And I make, I've been doing some library trustee trainings because I am a trustee in my own community. Like, we practice. How do you speak positively in a public comment about a book? And we start with, like, oh my gosh, I loved Goodnight Moon. And I love going to the library and reading Goodnight Moon with my kid. So we start real small, but that is a counterbalance that is incredibly powerful to the destructive, out of context language that we hear. And it is a matter of practicing. That's part of what I've done with the Fight for the First groups. That's part of what Texas and Florida Freedom to Read Project do with anybody who talks to them. Like we don't need to worry about all the bad faith. We do need to speak loudly, positively, and it goes back to something Ashley Hope Perez, author, band author extraordinaire, said at the beginning, which is we have to learn to speak for the world that we want. We have to offer that and speak it publicly over and over again. And I think that that's a really important lesson to take away because these groups are very good at making people feel frightened. And you don't need to feel frightened because every single possible poll says that people don't like book bans. People don't like you telling them what their kids should learn in school. They want to trust their teachers. They do trust their teachers. And we have a very loud vocal minority that we need to counterbalance. And the best way to do that is with positive, affirmative attention. And I would argue too, like, don't forget about Florida. Don't forget about the South. Don't forget about Texas, because those people are doing the work. Like Louisiana librarians doing the work. And you can learn a lot as a Wisconsin resident. I've learned so much for sort of like how to be organized, how to look for concerns developing in my community from those folks. And they are passionately defending the freedom to read in some tough places. I think
Yeah.
that's
I wrote down positive too, and I think I really love that this has come in the conversation. You know, I serve on my local school board, and I can count, I think, on one hand, the number of times we've had positive public comments at our school board meetings. And so from a school board perspective, I would make a couple of recommendations. One, yes, please come and speak about the positive things that are happening. Two, learn your district's policies. One of the roles of a school board is to set policy. And so if you go onto the district website, see if you can find the policies that they have about acquiring books and or potentially getting rid of books, because that's something that, you know, that is the law, the governance of the school district. So get to know the policy. And also I would say, if you can make recommendations to your superintendent and school board about public comment, you can ask that people who speak at public comment say that they live within the district or are a parent or an employee of the district, so that you don't get a lot of these people coming in from outside trying to make comments. We had someone come in wearing a t-shirt that said "Groomers, we see you" at a public school board meeting and read from a book. So just a couple of things to add to that kind of policy conversation. But we do have a couple of questions from folks in the audience, so I want to get those out to both of you.
Before we get to those questions, really quickly, one thing that you said is to look for the policies. Hopefully, your school district has policies. We have heard from people who are frustrated because their school district does not have policies and their superintendents don't want to have policies because there's no problem. And so you don't need a policy until you need a policy. And it not only protects parents and student rights, but it protects educators as well. So it helps people have a guideline for what they're supposed to do. How do I determine what it is we purchase? How do I deselect what we have in our libraries? We don't keep everything in our libraries. If we kept every book that has ever been purchased in our school libraries, we would have no room for people, right? There's only so much room on the shelf. So you have to deselect things over time. You have policies for those for a reason. And if your school district does not have those, that is something you can have a frank conversation with your school leaders about. We need one of these in place for a variety of reasons. And if you need examples of those are things that can be made available. Talk with, again, your state school library association, if you're looking at school libraries, and then your state library association if you're looking at public libraries. And I predict academic libraries are not far away from this battle. So we're going to get there. All right, go ahead.
No,
Sorry.
that is excellent, excellent advice. Thank you. So Maddie's question is, she says, I'm doing my capstone project on how the banning of books is causing conflict for teachers in high schools, yet there's not a lot of scholarly research. Based on your personal experiences, how would you say that the bans are affecting meeting of standards?
Well, first of all, there's not a lot of scholarly research because we haven't had enough time. You have to have time to be able to set up the study, to be able to know what you're studying, to get the permissions to do the research. We haven't had enough time in between here yet to have all of that going. If we were relying on research, we'd be looking probably back in the 80s when this was a hot thing as well. And that probably would not serve us as well as things that are more current. So that's probably why you're not seeing it. You're going to see more anecdotal articles and things that are news, as in what is happening in the moment, as opposed to that scholarly research. We're probably a few years out from that. But yeah, there are definitely some effects on social studies classes. I know someone was talking about AP. Yeah, there's some topics that are required to be taught in AP courses, required literature that's in AP courses that some students won't have access to, but then there's states who push back, like Florida, and will say, well, we just won't have that class. So, Taslin?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right on with the time. Like, this is so new and so fast moving that people have not had the time to do the academic studies. I work at following as many educators online that I can to hear what they're saying, to gather some anecdotal stories about it. I do know that the larger purpose of the attacks on libraries is about attacks on education, attacks on teaching, attacks on public education in our public spaces. That's why we can bounce from public library to public school, back to the public library. We don't like any CRT in our public library. I'm starting to hear that more and more, which, they've sort of run into the ground basically in some areas in the districts, and so now they're coming for the books in the public libraries. When I think we will start to see an incredible impact on student scores, student testing. And I think some people are starting to keep counts of both scores and then also the cost, the great amount of financial cost that a book challenge has on a district or a library. I just looked at another district that was estimating $100,000 for a challenge. And I tell every district that I get the chance to talk to, keep track, keep incredible financial records, and also look at your staff time, because librarians are not, that's not your job to do 50 challenges. Your job is to work with kids, and those 50 challenges are taking money, time, and expertise away from the young people in that community. And the more that we talk about things like that, we'll absolutely begin to start to speak to some of those folks who are being a little quiet because they're scared of all the dangerous groomer porn talk. We need to wake them up, make them understand what this is really about. But AP English, as an English nerd, like kind of writer, the decimation of that list, I mean, it's huge, and kids will not have access.
Well, and a school librarian's job is to teach. We are teachers first, right? We teach classes. Elementary librarians mostly teach classes all day long. And then, at secondary, we're collaborating and working with classes in a variety of different ways. And we probably have one of the largest budgets, if there's a budget for the library, right? The other thing that we're starting to see, and I neglected to mention this earlier, is one of the things that is a move is to remove the school librarian from the equation. We're
Yeah.
starting to see an increase in the number of positions that are being cut. So not that the librarian is terminated in any way, but they're pink slipped basically. And some of that has to do with educational funding. There's no requirement in some states that schools have to have a certified school librarian. So they will have a classified staff member who is there to check out books. Sometimes there's one person at the district level who's doing all of the purchasing of the materials, but doesn't actually interact with students in any way. So there's some other ways that censorship can come around. And one of those is to eliminate those library positions. And we are starting to see that increase. So again, if you're in an area where there is not a certified school librarian in your building, or where that position has been cut or is being cut, that is a time for you to speak out and to explain why that position is vital for your school community. Not only are they specifically trained in inquiry and research, digital citizenship, information literacy, all of these other areas that we have specifically been trained to do, but we also have training in selection of materials. So very few other people in your school district have potentially master's level education in those areas. So we need to protect those in addition, because those are the folks who are doing the work. Yeah. There's one other question in the chat.
Yeah, so Annie asked a great question. She says, I'm trying to support teachers to include more historical fiction in their social studies classes to encourage engagement and foster historical empathy. Do you have any organizations or resources to recommend for me?
Your school librarian. I've had social studies teachers do this. In one of my previous schools, we actually did units together where the students had to pick a book that they were going to read that was in the decades that they were researching in US history. And so we had a whole collection of things, and they got to go through and they were picking it, and they did journals back and forth with where they compared what they read in their historical fiction to what they were learning in the classroom. And it was magical, and I absolutely loved it. But that was a collaboration between that classroom teacher and myself, because again, trained to do those things and find that information. But if you are not lucky enough to have a certified school librarian in your building, talk with your public librarians. And there are also some great resources out there through NCTE that might have some resources there. And then there's some places where you can go to look at reviews for books and things like that. So there are people who are amazing historical fiction authors who do a ton of research, like Alan Gratz and Ruta Sepetys and Lori Hulse Anderson. So it just kind of depends on what you're looking for. But yeah, start with your librarian.
Yeah. I don't have any practical advice to offer except for to say that sounds amazing. That is the class that I want my kids to be taking. That is the class that I want to be taking. And I just finished a conversation that will appear during Banned Books Week with Melinda Lowe. And I asked her, like,
Phenomenal.
Yeah, how does she start her research for her incredible books? Because they're all a lush world. Last Telegraph, that is
Last Night at the Telegraph Club.
Oh, so beautiful. Such a great historical fiction. But she said to me, literally, it's the librarian. I said, where do you get the, she's like, I get a little story idea and then I'm with the librarian. And so, like, always, when in doubt, go to your librarian. That is the answer.
Can I just say how much I love how you're both lighting up at these book recommendations and talking about books that you love? And isn't that what we want, right? For our students too, to think of a book and go, this book,
Absolutely. I mean, this is what we are taking away from young people
Yeah.
as this crisis unfolds. Like, we talk a lot about the authors, and I can tell you a lot about what's happened to them, but and we talk a lot about the jobs, and that's very real, very, very, very real. But the young people are this love and joy and kind of excitement about literature and the things that you can find and explore. That's what we're taking away that will have ramifications that we can't even quite understand.
Agreed.
And how are the students in your circles, your education communities reacting to these book bans and censorship?
That is an excellent question. I think that there's some places where they're aware of it, some places they're really not. I would say in my school, just with the teenagers that I work with, they're not aware of the legislation that is being proposed in a lot of respects. It's not, to be fair though, like I was not really aware of the legislation that was being proposed in my state until about 4 years ago. Like it wasn't something that I was super concerned about. So I didn't follow along in a way that I should have. Like I kick myself now. I was not a very engaged citizen. I did not understand the process. I didn't know that my voice mattered. It is one of those things where we as educators need to let our students know that their voice is powerful. Even though they're younger, they can still, if they want to, they can reach out, they can speak out. I put in a link for SEAT in Texas. They should not be the ones who are leading the charge, but if they want to be involved and activated, okay, let's do this, because that means that they're probably going to be involved in active grown-ups down the road, right? If they feel passionate about things now and they realize that their voice matters at the age that they are, they're more likely to use it when they're my age, right? Because I didn't know that. I didn't understand how this whole process worked. So I think giving students the tools and the understanding that it's not just like a concept that you're forced to learn in school, that it really truly is like you are part of the political and legislative process. These people are supposed to be representing you as a constituent and a community member and a resident. If they're not doing that, tell them, right? So if you had an employee who was not doing their job to the best of their ability and you did not agree with what they were doing, you would tell them. Well, our politicians work for us. So it's our job to speak out and let them know when things are not going the way we think they should. Because I will tell you, that is something I learned. They may not like keep track of exactly what you said, but they keep tick marks of how many times they are contacted for or against something. And they bring those up in legislative hearings. They bring those up in committee meetings. Well, I've been contacted X amount of times by this side and 4 times by this side. They look at those numbers. So your voice does matter. And I will tell you, I had parts of a letter that I wrote to senators read on the floor while I was in the hearing hall. You never know what you do that's going to make a difference. So again, speak out, share that positivity, say why you love things, say why you think things are important, say why you disagree with things. Your voice matters.
Yes, 100%. Yes. Um, it can't be said enough. I love the SEAT folks. I love Cameron Samuels. Like, they're amazing. And then the other group that jumped into my mind was the DALO folks that come out of South Carolina. And all of these groups kind of know about each other, but they aren't really overwhelmingly connected. But again, like I really firmly believe that if there are young people in your community, like your job is to stand up for them, to speak with them, to support them. And if they are so gracious and aware enough to join you, that's wonderful, but they should not have to save us. Like this is a mess of our own making, and the adults need to be speaking for them. And I can't stress that enough, because I also have seen, unfortunately, community groups push young people out into a public setting who were not prepared, and they were not prepared to speak. And no young person, no person should have to testify to their worth or their humanity in a public comments at a school board meeting. That is not okay. And so yes, please find the groups, work with them, talk to them, listen to what they have to say about things. But like you gotta step out on your own too. And I'm here. I will tell people over and over, email me. My name's super unusual, so you can find me anywhere on social media. I'm happy to walk alongside you as you use your voice, because you are the most powerful person in that room to speak up.
Beautiful. Thank you both so much. And we're getting kind of close to the time here, so I want to kind of wrap up with one final two-part question for both of you. So, what's the triage right now? Like, what do we need to prioritize? And what's the hope?
I think they're both the same thing, honestly. Because again, every district, every public library board, every state legislation, it's all very different. Number one, just educate yourself on how things work. So how do you submit comment? How do you work with different folks? Again, if you're an educator, talk with your education association, because they have a lobbyist that works directly with a lot of these things. And we have like a Capitol Hill update that comes out from ours that will tell us, you know, like, here's the things we're tracking, here's the things you should be aware of, that kind of thing. So just kind of be aware, first of all. But, and we've said this repeatedly, like what we need is people who are for intellectual freedom, who are for libraries, who are for public education, because a lot of this is kind of a stab at defunding public education as well. So if you are speaking out in favor of these things, again, you're providing a different perspective. If we had all of the people who were pro-library comment in some way to their school board or their public library board versus the people who are not, imagine the avalanche, right? What's the difference between those things? People who are happy don't always comment on things. It's the people who are unhappy, the squeaky wheel, right, that you hear so much from. We need to have the people who are happy and want things to progress to also use their voices. So that's the triage, is we need people to be engaged and involved. And that's where the hope comes from, right? Having those people, hearing those things, having that reported in your state paper or, you know, in the local news or whatever it happens to be, that would give people hope and maybe encourage more people to speak out.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I tell people speak positively, proactively, and publicly as much as possible. I would add one point of triage: your librarians and your educators. And I know I'm speaking to a room full of them. They've been doing this, they've been fighting now for 3 years. They're tired, they've been doxxed, they've been threatened, they've been called groomers, pedophiles. They need to know that they matter. And so I tell everybody that I know to also, while you're writing your letters to the legislators, while you're writing to everybody else, you're also writing to your librarian and thanking them for their service and thanking the educators for their service, because being in the public places absolutely is something that is a service to the community and makes a difference every single day. So I'm trying to direct my community folks' energy to also remembering those folks who've been on the front lines for the longest amount of time, and speaking for them. But speak up positively, proactively, and publicly as often as possible. Oh,
Fear-
yes. I see a little thing, and I just want to say, too, this is what I say to people who tell me it's okay to buy a book. Like, it's not banned if it's, you can buy it somewhere. I know. Courtney just put it in the chat, but I have to tell you, like, a young person, a school library is vital, right? Like, it is vital. Sometimes it's their only safe place to get a book. Sometimes there are no bookstores in their community. Sometimes their parents can't take them to a bookstore. Sometimes there are no ability to order online. You don't know. And so for one young person, that library is their world. That librarian is their connection. And so a book is absolutely banned when we take it out of access for young people. And I
That's
will,
the counter argument that I hear so often.
Yes.
And it's so frustrating because it's like, yes, it is. I don't know what your definition of banned is, but it is
Yeah.
inaccurate. And even if you had the money to buy every book that your kid wanted, again, you would have no room for people in your house because all of those books that the kids read, that like I think about the like 100 books that we would read in the summers for
Yeah.
the summer reading. That's just the summer. You know, like if we had bought all of those books and had them in my house,
No
what?
space. No space.
No. So, I mean, it's just an illogical argument that they're, throwing. Well, it's not banning. Like and that's the other thing is watch that changing playbook.
Yes.
Because in the beginning, we wanted to ban books. Then they realized people didn't like that word. And so now we're not banning books because they're still available on Amazon. So, like
It does not.
it does
not.
change, like the strategies from the pro censorship side of things change over time in response to how people are reacting. So just keep an eye on that as well.
Access. That's really what we're
Yep,
talking about here
100%.
is access for everybody. And I didn't even ask you to set this up like this, but that's an excellent segue into kind of a last couple of slides that I wanted to share before we say goodbye. First of all, I just wanted to thank the Library of Congress. Speaking of libraries, the Equity Summit last year was sponsored in part by the Library of Congress with Teaching with Primary Sources Eastern Region program coordinated by Waynesburg. And the Library of Congress is an incredible resource, and they fund a lot of amazing programs for educators and communities, and this Equity Summit being one of them. And so we are incredibly grateful to them. We will be having another Equity Summit in just a couple of weeks, and it is about access for all learners. And we'll be talking in particular about a couple of different types of access, including rural students, students with disabilities, and at-risk youth. So please join us. It's free. Registration is required, but we would love to see you there. It's Saturday the 28th from 11 to 4 Eastern Time. And we can, you can find this on our website, on the National Council for the Social Studies website. It is another joint program that we are really excited about. The keynote speaker is Dr. Bernardine Futrell, who is the Undersecretary, I think that's the correct title, Undersecretary of the Department of Education, which will be excellent. And then last two couple of slides, our friends at NCSS are hosting their annual conference in Boston in November, which is the same weekend as NCTE. So Boston is going to be just like teeming with educators. It's going to be amazing. So Jenny, anything that you want to pop in about the conference?
Lori Halse Anderson will be there. Doris Kearns Goodwin. We're going to end the whole show with Ken Burns. So we had to create a whole new schedule for all of our speakers, so we got some pretty awesome ones. So hopefully we'll see you in Boston.
And that's at socialstudies.org. And then finally, the NCHE conference is a little bit farther down the road. It's in St. Louis in March, but we are still accepting session proposals through September 23rd. And so we would love to see some session proposals from our library and media specialist friends. Please feel free to look at ncheteach.org/conference. So with that, I want to extend a huge thanks to our presenters, to Courtney, to Taslin, and to NCSS for partnering with us. Thank you so much, everybody, for being with us this evening, and I hope that we'll see you again at a future webinar. Thanks, everybody.